Mr. Tanner narrowed his eyes, tightening his focus on the screen and numbers before him, if that was even possible, given his concentration had already been almost impossibly ironclad. He was hunched over a small but sleek laptop on his mahogany desk, with stacks of papers towering all around him, each organised impeccably, just like everything else in his dimly lit office. To any observer, he would have been indistinguishable from a grim, sinister statue, but for the occasional reluctant exhalation, emerging as a minute puff of steam in the callously cold air before vanishing without a trace. Then he heard it. Unmistakable. A slight buzz from the frosty, north-facing window to his left. Mr. Tanner flinched, his perfect concentration fractured, his eyes narrowed further, this time in suspicion. He turned his grey head to inspect the guilty corner, but saw nothing. He maintained the one-sided staring contest with his unseen opponent for some time before returning to his work, punching a few numbers firmly into his primitive calculator and locking his gaze firmly on the screen again. A few minutes went by, and Mr. Tanner's shoulders returned to their original position of focus, having deviated by a matter of millimeters in his unpleasant shock. He swiftly erased the unwelcome distraction from his mind, and was soon back in his familiar state of efficient productivity. As all things should be, he would have thought to himself, if he had any spare attention for an inner monologue. Suddenly, his head whipped round to the same corner as before, from which he had now heard another sound, more distinct than the last. This was no electrical fault, no flickering light. This was something far worse as far as the old accountant was concerned. It was a living creature. In his office of all places. His shoulders were now clenched, every muscle in his frame quivering in preparation for necessary action. Yet for the moment he remained seated, still almost motionless, though his eyes darted around like a searchlight, seeking the offending party like hungry greyhounds in pursuit of their prey. His eyesight was sharp for his years, but still he saw nothing besides the carefully selected, albeit sparse, display of books on the shelf beneath the window, and the sickly grey paint which had clung to the wall since at least 10 prime ministers ago. Undecided whether to pursue this outrageous disturbance or pour all of his cruel energy into blocking out the distraction and returning to work, Mr. Tanner scowled and was for a moment about to mutter something under his breath, but restrained himself with the thought that this would serve no obvious end. Eventually, he resolved to return to his business, but this time he could not shut the matter to his left entirely out of the back of his mind, but found it creeping in, his lips tightening until their colour began to drain, his hair bristling with anticipation, until eventually, "Right," he exclaimed, in a tone that was not loud, but far more unsettling than the fiercest yell of the next man. This word alone would have made the blood of any onlooker run cold, and could have induced guilt and shame in the most innocent of listeners. Decisively, he stood up in a single, sharp motion and took 2 precise steps towards the source of this outrageous racket. Still blind to his target, he moved each book on his shelf one by one, aiming to uncover the tiny fugitive sheltering somewhere in this corner, but found nothing except an ancient cobweb behind a rotten copy of Hamlet. Vowing to rid the room of the cobwebs at a later date, he returned to his callous metal chair, and, seeing no other course of action for the time being, resumed his work once again. But this time, even an outward pretense of concentration was impossible. His eyes wandered constantly in the direction of his thoughts, which were now primarily focused on the source of his frustration, and on various plans to eradicate it. After every few calculations, he would swivel his entire head and stare at that disobedient corner, receiving no reply. Eventually, Mr. Tanner realised he had stopped typing altogether, and was staring in silence at the window, vaguely aware of the heavy, lethargic tick-tock of the grandfather clock that loomed over the desk, but otherwise entirely focused on catching his suspect. He clenched his fists, he growled vengefully, and eventually the tension grew so overwhelming that he stood up, stormed over to the cabinet on the other side of his office, and began to unlock it, fumbling as he strived to enter the correct combination in his blind fury. After some time, he succeeded, and rummaged around until he found his weapon of choice. A small white spray bottle, with a bright orange warning sticker on the side. Without caring to read the instructions, the accountant-turned-vigilante marched over to the now despised corner and began to spray, at first carefully, then more boldly, then frantically, billowing out clouds of choking mist until he himself began to cough and tears streamed from his eyes. "I have you now," he crowed aloud, continuing to spray even as his lungs began to ache from coughing. After some time, he was forced to stop by his need to breathe, and he retreated to the far side of the room, spluttering and blinking intensely. It took several minutes until he was able to breathe almost normally again, and he leaned grudgingly on the cabinet as he struggled to calm himself down. Suddenly remembering his foe, the very reason for his violent attack, he staggered forward to observe the aftermath, hoping, needing to be comforted by the sight of his terminated victim. With each step forward, he grew more wary and less confident that he had achieved his goal. His breathing became more rapid again, as his imagination ran wilder and wilder, tormenting him with the anticipation of that dreadful, mocking sound. Buzz. And there it was. The antagonist lived on, and sounded not only alive and well, but scornful somehow. How was that even possible? Mr. Tanner began to imagine all sorts of insults being hurled at him by this non-verbal enemy, and countered back with several of his own, of which his mother would not have been particularly proud. But there was now only one thing on his mind, one singular focus for which he narrowed his eyes and clenched his ancient shoulders greater than ever before. Any notion of work or productivity was at best a distant memory, almost laughably so. His mouth tightened further into what was almost, curiously, an angry smile, a half grin, half grimace. He advanced towards where he imagined this cowardly beast was most likely to be. In a flash of inspiration, he picked up his old metal chair, ignoring the biting cold on his hands as they gripped the frame, ignoring all rationality that would have informed him of the insanity of such a course of action, ignoring everything but this sole ambition which now consumed his consciousness. He took another, final, merciless step towards the window, still scanning the entire corner for that scorning villain, his vision clouded by the thought of its plotting eyes, its evil wings, its menacing legs. Was it invisible? Was he being haunted and taunted by some phantom or spirit? With no further room to advance, Mr. Tanner stood motionless, trembling with every conceivable emotion, his eyes erratically searching, his breathing sporadic but furiously quick. There he remained for what felt like an eternity, firmly fixed in a state of fight or flight, and soundly set against any notion of flight. He waited, for his moment was evidently not yet. He waited as his counterpart remained out of sight, though by no means out of mind. He waited, and watched, and ached, and tired, and scowled, and muttered, and still he waited. And there it was. At last Tanner came face to face with the six-legged creature, buzzing gleefully, and enraging him all the more in doing so. In an instant, without a moment's hesitation, he seized his chance, and with an impressive show of strength for his frail, aging frame, launched the sad little chair directly at the fly, with a yell of vengeance and rage so overbearing that it almost drowned out the cacophony of shattering glass as the chair flew straight through the window and tumbled 2 stories onto the frozen ground below. The yell continued long after the shards had settled, and then came a heavy, painful silence. The old bookkeeper stood absolutely motionless, surrounded by the remnants of his window, some dust he had inadvertently unsettled from the sill, and his thoughts. The silence endured until he broke it with a self-vindicating cry. "You see, you got exactly what you deserved for disturbing my peace." He paused, as if expecting, or perhaps fearing, a reply. Nothing. "I'd do it again," he continued. "I'd smash that window again. I'd smash 1,000 windows, and it would be a no less worthy trade for your pathetic existence." Still, his taunts received no response. "I intended that wholeheartedly," he added, as if now trying to justify his actions to the universe herself. "I am a calculating man, and I regret nothing." Neither his nemesis nor the universe seemed to offer a response, so the silence resumed, to which Mr. Tanner smirked grimly, feeling vindicated, though perhaps not quite so vindicated as he might have felt if he had seen the corpse of his victim. Eventually, he returned to his desk and stood, evidently unbothered by the missing chair, the freezing air whistling in through the gaping hole where the window had recently been, not to mention the shards of glass glistening in his peripheral vision. After a single, somewhat disappointed sigh, he collected himself and began entering numbers into his calculator, as though nothing had happened on that harsh winter afternoon. His mouth formed into something almost resembling a smile, as though satisfied that he had overcome a great trial and had returned the world to rights, and could finally enter a state of focus again. Only his eyes betrayed a change from the man that had sat before, betrayed a certain fragility in that old state of focus and perfect calculating confidence, betrayed the possibility that he could be shaken again by something as small and innocent as... He shook his head and shut the thought out. But he couldn't help but listen out for a moment and cast a furtive glance towards the window. Surely not, he thought. I am safe, he thought. I am a calculating man, he thought, and calmed down for a moment. And then he heard, from the opposite side of the room than before, "Buzz?"